found a lot of material on King and Africa. Starting with this flyer, this really piqued my interest. This is a flyer from a speech he gave in 1964, sponsored by the American Committee on Africa. There's a ton of material on the American Committee on Africa in the African Activist Archive. And this is him speaking at Hunter College. There's about 2,000 people there. This is December 10th. You can also see that Miriam Makeba is there. From South, it just says Songs from South Africa is her presentation. And it's plus a South African ally, formerly jailed in his homeland, Peter Seeger, folk singer. And then there are others who are there. So I was really intrigued by this. And I actually was able to dig up the speech. And the speech is really revelatory. So we're about halfway through King's career. King had a very short career, 57 to 68 when he was brutally assassinated. But you can see there's a sharp trajectory. Now, this is right in the middle of it. But what I'm going to talk about is the fact that from the very beginning of his political career, 57, he was engaged with Africa. And even until the end in 68, he was engaged with Africa. And he would have been more engaged, as he said, if he had time. But the civil rights movement was such a tenacious fight. He did not have the time that he desired. But he's speaking at Hunter College, and just to pull out some of the things that he says, if I can move forward. There we go. He's describing, to me, this speech is the most forceful statement that he's made on South Africa. Most of his statements on South Africa and anti-imperialism are when he's going abroad. But this one is in the state, and you'll be hard pressed to find, unless he's doing a specific speech on civil rights. If he's just making a political speech, he usually references South Africa or anti-imperialism or settler colonialism in some way, which I found fascinating. But in this one, he's playing against this justification of European control over Africans in general. Their backwardness, their lack of government, lack of rule of law, savagery. But he's in this phase of his career where he's really condemning Europeans' monopoly on moral violence and their use of brutality to impose either settler colonialism, deny African Americans their rights, or the tenacious hold that Portuguese continue to hold over Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. So rather than Africans be the savages, what does he say? He says Africa does have savages. They do have savages. They have spectacular savages and brutes. But he says they're not Black. They're the sophisticated white rulers of South Africa who profess to be cultural, religious, and civilized, but whose conduct on philosophy stamped them unmistakably as modern-day barbarians. Now, this is not the King that we get on King Day, is it? This is not the dreamer. This is not the dreaming King. But this statement is far more consistent with King's philosophy and practices than anything related to I Have a Dream. Now, the March on Washington, the so-called I Have a Dream speech is a powerful speech. But he makes more statements like this than he does about the dream. He references the dream every once in a while. But then he goes on specifically on South Africa. In South Africa today, all opposition to white supremacy is condemned as communism. And in its name, due process is destroyed. A medieval segregation is organized with 20th century efficiency and drive. A sophisticated form of slavery is imposed by a minority upon a majority who are kept in grinding poverty. This one's a good slide. Yeah. Well, I can read it from up there if you want to take it. Who are kept in grinding poverty, the dignity of human personality defiled, and world opinion is arrogantly defied. This is what my research suggests is the real King. This reflects who King was. And what I began to do as I put my study together, which became the manuscript, is I see that he's not only making statements against apartheid, statements against settler colonial rule, statements against ongoing European imperialism, very strong statements against white supremacy in general, but he's also active, largely through the American Committee on Africa. The American Committee on Africa is probably the longest American organization in support of anti-colonial movements in Africa, founded by pacifist, Christian, mostly white men. Only later on did it start having African-American members of its board and of its staff. But it's through the American Committee on Africa that King, who sat on its board for many years, is not only making statements, but also meeting with, supporting, and making statements with African liberation leaders and anti-colonial leaders. What I call this is the Pan-African Network of Nonviolence. Most of these figures, which makes them unique, most of these figures are Christian. Many of them are Christian lay ministers or ministers. Think of Albert Lutuli. Most of these individuals are Pan-Africanists. All of these individuals declare nonviolent mass protest as their guiding method and philosophy. All of them claim that Gandhi's Satyagraha that began in South Africa in 1906, brought to India in 1914, it became the centerpiece of the Indian independence movement, all claim some form of ideological descent from Gandhi. They say Gandhi is this part of Gandhi's legacy. I'm inspired by Gandhi. This includes Nelson Mandela, of course, until 60. This includes Tom Mboya in Kenya, the trade unionist in Kenya. This includes Kenneth Kaunda in Southern Rhodesia, Zambia. It includes Miriam Makeba in South Africa and in exile. It includes Albert Lutuli and many, many others. There's too many to name. These are just the giants of it. And of course, it includes Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. It includes Martin Luther King. He's in conversation with all of them. He's declaring solidarity with all, and they're declaring solidarity with him. Tom Mboya, Kenneth Kaunda coming to the United States through the American Committee on Africa, and Martin Luther King hosting them at the SCLC, raising money for them through the SCLC. So these are all mass nonviolent actors. What distinguishes them is that they're Pan-Africanists. They take Satyagraha from India and they apply it to the unique environment in their countries in Africa and to the United States. So this is a Pan-Africanist network of nonviolence. The irony is that if you look at Gandhi in the South African iteration of his movement, would you say that he would have been sympathetic to an African version of Satyagraha? In fact, his concerns when he's in South Africa until about 1914, 1913. He's in for 20 years. He's there. He goes back during the start of World War I. His concern was entirely with the Asian community. He was not concerned about Africans. He was very much being shrewd, being strategic about leveraging Indian status as citizens of the empire, a status that Africans in South Africa did not have. He's very concerned as the Asian community in the Transvaal and Natal gain economic influence. Of course, they come over mostly as indentured servants, and then the merchants follow. And then anytime you have a large merchant community, you're going to have lawyers following them. And so this is a dynamic Indian, Hindu, and Muslim community. Gandhi comes over as one of those lawyers to support this merchant community, Muslim and Hindu merchant community. Their interests are his interests. This is what he's concerned with. As creeping anti-Indian sentiments emerge, there's concern about their status there. And so he's interested in demonstrating himself as a good citizen of empire, supporting the English in the Anglo-Boer War as stretcher bearers. And then as the Asiatic, soon there's rumors that this Asiatic Registration Act is coming, which will mean that Indians coming to South Africa must register. Their numbers are going to be limited. Their movement has to be documented. They have to carry a pass. They can only occupy certain occupations. The concern is what? That this is going to reduce Indian status to those of Black South Africans. So they call this the Black Act. That's not the real term for it, but Indians call it the Black Act. Gandhi makes many statements declaring, he's saying, you're going to reduce us to the level of Kafirs, to Black South Africa. Their concern is not necessarily equality with white South Africans, with the Boers, and with the English in South Africa. The concern is not to be reduced to the level of what? Of Black South Africans. And so he makes some very interesting statements. And pointing to the irony, how can we reconcile Africans and African Americans looking to Gandhi as a model when Gandhi shows that he is not invested in their interests and that he is in fact racist. He writes in the Indian Opinion. Indian Opinion was his newspaper. I think it was founded in 1903 or so. It continues to be the editor till 1914 when he leaves, and then it goes on. You could find issues online. I believe his son took it over when he went back to India. Many essays he wrote on the so-called Black Act, or Indian status there, and also on the Anglo Boer War and the role that they played in it. In 1906, we have the final act of mass violent resistance to European settler colonialism in South Africa. That's the Bambata Rebellion, 1906. Their cattle's being stolen, their land is being stolen, they have myriad taxes being placed on them, and then one final tax is the last tax that they're going to stand. So clan rises up to resist this violently. The last act of violent resistance to settler colonialism by Black South Africans, and General Zulus in particular. What is Gandhi going to do? He's going to leverage this act of resistance by Africans to show himself a loyal citizen of empire. He says, give us guns. We'll help you fight the Zulu. Give us guns. But there's a law that prevents Indians from having guns. This is Gandhi. Gandhi's saying, give us guns. Then finally, he says, well, we'll go back to what we did with the Anglo-Boer War, and we will be stretcher bearers. We'll be an ambulance corps during this resistance. Very few South African, let's say white South Afrikaner soldiers died in this, but they were still assisting them. So he makes a statement he writes an essay in the Indian Opinion. It is not for me to say whether the revolt of the Kafirs is justified or not. We are in Natal by virtue of British power. Our very existence depends on it. It is therefore our duty to render whatever help we can. That is, if the government so desires, we should raise an ambulance corps. This is Gandhi, the father of Satyagraha and nonviolent mass action, and a model for the world. How can we reconcile his positions here with the man who's heralded, as I'm going to show you in a minute, as the Indian saint? Gandhi cites, let's continue the story. Obviously, the British don't reward the Indians for the role they play in the Bambata Rebellion and supporting the South Africans, supporting the British. In fact, they imposed the Indian Registration Act and other laws to restrict Indians' movements. And so here we have the beginnings of Indians organizing for their civil rights. And he declares there's so many September 11th. Allende in Chile is assassinated September 11th. We have our own September 11th here. In South Africa, Gandhi says September 11th is the beginning of mass civil disobedience, a non-violent mass action, which he has a contest to name it. He names it Satyagraha, Truth Force, or truth seeking. And this is September 1906. On the heels of the Bambata Rebellion and the imposition of the Indian Registration Act, our rights are not being protected as we think they should be by empire. Therefore, we're going to do mass protests, picket lines, strikes, refusal to work some days, refusing to carry your permits. Gandhi is arrested in 1907 and sentenced first of many arrests that he'll suffer. But this becomes the model, though. We're going to see this time and again throughout the global South. Picket lines, protests, strikes, and using arrests strategically. This is Satyagraha. And he brings this back to India in 1914, and it becomes the centerpiece of the Indian independence movement. How can we reconcile that with what W.E.B. Du Bois writes in 1921 in The Crisis? African Americans are looking at the Indian independence movement. It's amazing to see these people that are, faces at the bottom of the well, fighting the greatest power in the world, fighting British Empire and winning. Africans are looking at this. Kwame Nkrumah is in the United States looking at this movement. Azikiwe is looking at it. Kenyans are looking at this movement of Indians, and they're debating, could this be something that we can do against empire? Is this something we can do in the United States against white supremacy and injustice? A huge debate erupts in the African-American press. Most are saying no. The Indian model is impossible. We don't have the numbers. White people here are violent the way that British aren't violent. They're going to mow us down. There's going to be a backlash. We can't do this. But there's a long 20 some odd year debate erupts. And we have an early example of a position in favor. Most were opposed, in fact. We take it for granted that the African-American struggle is mass nonviolent civil disobedience, mass nonviolent protest. That was not the case until 1957. Until 1957, the African-American movement for social justice was largely in the courts or labor unions, some strikes, but it was mostly litigation through which African-Americans defended their interests. We had some unions. Sleeping Car Porters was the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was the biggest one. Most African-Americans could not conceive of mass protests in the streets combined with litigation. Mass protests in the streets combined with lobbying Congress. Strikes. They couldn't imagine it because this is an era of mass lynchings for even saying anything that can be seen as defending your interests. But here's Du Bois in 1921. The Crisis magazine was the most widely read journal among African Americans. No middle-class household did not subscribe to the journal. This is the mouthpiece of the NAACP, and W.E.B. Du Bois was its founder and its longtime editor. And from its inception, was always interested in Africa, always interested in the Caribbean. There's always some information on the Caribbean and Africa in the Crisis. Here he is in 1921. He had the looking glasses, his opinion section where he would write his perspective. He writes of the Indian saint. And he's musing. What might this mean, this movement going on in India? What might it mean for us? What might it mean for the African world? Remember, this is the man who wrote in 1900, 6 years after the Battle of Ottawa, where the Ethiopians defeated the Italians, 15 years after the conference in Berlin, where Europeans decided how they're going to divide Africa. 1900, he's speaking at the first Pan-African Conference. He says in Westminster, London, he says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He's saying that at the very first year of the 20th century. And he goes on as a longer part of it. I don't memorize the whole quote, but it's not, people just stop there. But he goes on to say, basically he's talking about what will white supremacy mean for Africa, Asia, and the islands of the sea. He doesn't say how we're going to respond to white supremacy, but he says it's going to define our existence. Who has and who has not is going to be defined on the color line. So he's been prescient from the very beginning. 1921, he's writing, non-cooperation has determined, therefore, upon a bloodless revolution, she will win her rights. She will compel England to grant them. This is India. How? Not by violence, not by indulging even in a single act of violence, but by non-cooperation with her foreign rulers and by suffering. And he goes on to say, the Indian people propose peacefully, but resolutely, to strike against their foreign masters, refusing to cooperate with them in anything or to aid them in anything until their rights are granted. And they propose to suffer without retaliation or revenge the penalties visited upon them, however heavy they must be. So it's a philosophical position. It's also a pragmatic position when you're dealing with powers that are greater than you. Now, that's not to say that I don't think Gandhi believed in the nonviolence as a philosophy, but there's a pragmatism to it as well. So here, Du Bois is proposing this for the African struggle and the African American struggle. Most oppose this. But the question is, what might this mean if adopted for the struggles of the United States and Africa? Let me see, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. So one way that this became central to, how come I can't get this back? One way this became, there's this story. So how does this become central to the African-American struggle? How does it become central to King? Mass nonviolent action, mass nonviolent civil disobedience. The story he tells is that when he's a graduate student at Crozer Seminary in Philadelphia, it's actually in Chester, Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia, Mordecai Johnson, who was one of the most sought-after speakers of the mid-20th century, he's first African-American president of Howard University. Howard University, founded in 1867, to educate freed slaves and create ministers and educators to go out to the African-American community among the formerly enslaved. First African-American president. We had Howard, I say we because I'm Howard, graduate of Howard, and I'm professor of Howard. I'm at Howard now. proud class of 1996. Our presidents were white until 1926. Mordecai Johnson was our first African-American president. King tells the story that as a seminary student at Crozier in must have been the early 50s, because then he went on to Boston College. Mordecai comes to speak. Mordecai is a Gandhi file. He's been studying Gandhi. He's been watching India. He's trying to spread the gospel of Gandhi and Gandhi. And this is a Christian minister. He's a Christian minister. Gandhi being a Hindu didn't matter. Mass nonviolent civil disobedience as a philosophy and a method for liberation. And so he goes to speak to Crozier, and he's speaking the gospel. He's preaching the gospel of Gandhi. King's story is that that's when he was awoken to Gandhi's philosophy. And then he goes off to Crozier's library, and he immerses himself, he says, in anything he could find by and about Gandhi. I say this is apocryphal. This is a nice story. King's father, his grandfather, and great-grandfather were all Baptist preachers. His father was good friends with Mordecai Johnson. And the story, the plot thickens. Mordecai, when he comes to Howard in 1926, wants to create Howard as a hub for the study of Gandhi's Satyagraha and as a laboratory for mass nonviolent civil disobedience among African Americans. There are some who are already there. Kelly Miller, he's already there. He's a Gandhiite at Howard. William Stewart Nelson is already there. He's a Gandhiite at Howard University. Mordecai, he recruits Howard Thurman, one of the most prominent African-American theologians of his day, who also happens to be a what? A Gandhiite. He's going to be dean of Rankin Chapel. That's Rankin Chapel, not back in the 1920s, that's now. You can see there's a scooter that's not properly parked right in front of it. That is just a couple months ago. Those scooters are all over campus. Are they all over Michigan State also? Somehow they're always at the bottom of the steps. It's ridiculous. Convenience. So Howard Thurman is a Gandhiite. Howard Thurman is one of the most influential African-American theologians of the 20th century. He also importantly recruits Dr. Benjamin Mays. Dr. Mays is a Morehouse man. So is Howard Thurman is a Morehouse man. Benjamin Mays will go on to become, so they try to create this hub of study, and they say, he's spreading, they're holding teachings on Gandhi, workshops on Gandhi. Students are getting into Gandhi. And one example of that is, just as an aside, Pauline Murray. Pauline Murray is a law student in the 1940s. She takes Mordecai Johnson's preaching about Gandhi and mass civil disobedience seriously. She launches the first student sit-ins of segregated lunch counters in the country in 1943. DC was a predominantly Black city, but the lunch counters were segregated. Blacks couldn't eat at the lunch counter. So she, in 1943, this is 17 years before the sit-ins in North Carolina, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 17 years, she organizes students to go to U Street and first force the luncheonettes to serve them. And so this was a sit-in movement before the sit-in movements even began. Let me go back again. Why I say King's story is an exaggeration, is somewhat a retelling of his biography, a reinvention of his biography, because his father was good friends with Mordecai. His father was a Black social gospel theologian like Mordecai, like Thurman, like Mays. He grew up in that space. He grew up reading the Crisis. He grew up reading Du Bois. He would have known about he knew about what was going on in India. He knew about Satyagraha, even as a young person growing up. He went to college at the age of 16. He went to Morehouse at 16. So he was a reader. So I think it's sort of like the self-made man kind of narrative, when in fact he grew up in this space. More importantly, Benjamin Mays would go on to become president of Morehouse College. Have you heard of Morehouse College? Dr. King happened to be a student at Morehouse College. Benjamin Mays, as president of Morehouse College, replicated what Mordecai Johnson did at Howard University, making Morehouse a hub for looking at Gandhi. He lectured every week, and many of these lectures were on who? Gandhi. Dr. King, the story goes, the story as I understand it goes, would always walk with Benjamin Mays after his lectures, and they would continue the conversation. I suspect that those conversations were also about Gandhi and mass nonviolent civil disobedience. So here we have uh, the growth of the idea of Gandhi within the African American intellectual community, make it even deeper. Benjamin Mays and Howard Thurman both went to visit Gandhi, and they sat with him. And I have a quote. I'm not gonna. I'm you know I'm the child of a preacher, so I speak more than I always intend to speak, and I'm very cognizant of the clock. But one of the questions when Howard Thurman and his wife Sue Bailey Thurman, they went first, and then Benjamin Mays went after them. But one of the questions they posed to Gandhi, Gandhi's very interested in them, asking questions about the civil rights movement and slavery. Asked them to Sue Bailey's a singer. He asked her to sing a spiritual. Always getting black folks to sing, but that's a little weird. That's fine. She sang. But you could imagine the question that they wanted to pose to Gandhi. I know the question I wanted to pose to Gandhi, which is when they posed him. Why did you disallow Africans from being part of your movement when you were in South Africa from 1906 to 1914? What is it about these statements that Africans did not have the capacity, the patience, some other words, the discipline to participate in satyagraha, to participate in mass nonviolent civil disobedience? He said, this is paraphrasing, that is what he believed at the time. But now he's gotten to know the history of African Americans in particular, and the history of Africa in general. And his prediction, I have a quote, but I'm as always, I'm moving away from my notes. He said, oh, I'm gonna have to paraphrase. He said, it seems to me now, with my understanding, that it's going to be the Black Americans, the Negroes of the United States, that are going to take satyagraha to the next level. So we see this evolution in Gandhi's thinking, whether real or rhetorical, we don't know. But he's professing to have changed. And just as an aside, that's, we had the debate about the Gandhi Must Fall projects that took place a few years ago. And this idea that Gandhi should be held up as a hero, but be that as it may, this is my research suggests that there was an evolution there, and I'll take him at his word. And he's looking at the American Negro as the next level of satyagraha. King grew up in this space. This is the origins of King taking mass nonviolent civil disobedience to the American struggle. It begins in Montgomery in 1957. That's the first major mass nonviolent protests among African Americans. Was that? I'm sorry, you're right. You're right. Thank you for that. It begins in 55, ends in 56. Yes, thank you for that. So it begins in 55, it's about 11 months, right? It ends in 56. What's important is that a few months after that struggle, the victorious struggle against segregated buses, African Americans having to sit in the back of the bus, even though they're the main riders of the bus, they're paying taxes. They prevail there with this long 11-month strike on the buses. He's invited along with a delegation of African Americans to go to Ghana. This is important because this debate around, can satyagraha be applied to the African American social justice struggle? Can satyagraha be applied to the African struggle for liberation against colonial rule and settler colonialism? Kwame Nkrumah is at the heart of this. Kwame Nkrumah also claims to be a Gandhiite. He even says, he claims to be the African Gandhi. He says we're going to take satyagraha and apply it to the African context. And he renames it what? Positive action. Strikes, boycotts, strategic arrest, being arrested for political reasons, marches, and they do that. And the world looks at this as an example, yet another example of mass nonviolent action working against empire. It worked in India, and now it worked in the Gold Coast. And on March 6, 1957, it becomes Ghana. So Martin Luther King is invited, along with many other African Americans, Charles Diggs, Adam Clayton Powell, I think Michael Manley of Jamaica is on the trip, many others. And he's tremendously inspired by what he saw in Ghana. Of course, he's interested in Africa. Before, this is his first African trip. He stops in Nigeria on the way, he and his wife, and then they go to Ghana. And he said the week before the trip, he gives a sermon where he speaks of the fraternity that he feels with Ghanaians, sense of brotherhood. When he returns, though, his language has evolved. He begins to talk about the civil rights struggle as being part of the global struggle against white supremacy. And he uses the term white supremacy. And it's just one arm of the struggle against imperialism. He says before he leaves, I felt that I had in my hand a fraternal greeting when he gets the letter from Kwame Nkrumah. There's a whole history of how he got invited. Bill Sutherland is African-American, who's Kwame Nkrumah's assistant for a time, and Bayard Rustin was supposed to be there, who's an advisor to Martin Luther King. There's a whole group. This is the abridged version of what happened. But he says when he got the letter, I felt that I had in my hand a fraternal greeting to the Negro people of Montgomery, whose tenacious struggle and sacrifices had won the admiration of all freedom-loving people. There is necessarily a close bond between the American Negro and Negroes of the Gold Coast, since a very large number of us trace our ancestry to that part of Africa, which is now Ghana. So here he's talking about a sense of kinship, but when he returns, he's speaking more about common cause. One of the ways that he manifests this is that in 1955 was the Freedom Charter, right? 1957. 1955 is the Freedom Charter. 1955 is Freedom Charter. Just a few years later, the American Committee on Africa organizes a declaration of conscience for the United States to kind of promote the Freedom Charter. Freedom Charter was Congress of the People. It was like really the first statement to really say, this is what a post-racist South Africa will look like. This is how all the people are going to come together. We're planning for the fall of apartheid. I don't think they could have seen that it was going to be another, 40 years before apartheid fell. But it was a powerful statement. You have these different organizations coming together, the Indian Congress, the Pan-African Congress, the ANC coming together, the communists coming together to make this statement about what a post-apartheid South Africa will look like. The American Committee on Africa writes the Declaration of Conscience, and Martin Luther King is one of the signatories, along with Eleanor Roosevelt and Bishop Pipe, the radical bishop from the Diocese of Episcopal Diocese of California. And King begins to deliver speeches around this. So he's now taken on the mantle of anti-apartheidism in the United States. So here we have these examples of India. We bring it to Ghana, the Gold Coast, and we have success there. And the idea is that South Africa will be next. Kwame Nkrumah wants Ghana to be the hotbed of Gandhiism for Africa. Ghana is going to be the model for the rest of the continent. We're going to do nonviolent, peaceful independence movements for Guinea-Bissau, for Mali, for Senegal, for Kenya. So he holds in 1958 the All African Peoples Conference. I'm sure you've heard of this famous conference, posters, so down with colonialism and imperialism. This idea that we're all coming together, heads of state and union leaders, activists, liberation leaders, and we're going to agree. George Padmore was one of the organizers of it, West Indian trade unionist who goes to Ghana to be his special advisor. Kwame Nkrumah is determined that he's going to be the Indian Gandhi, who drops on the scene to change things a little bit. You recognize that handsome young man there? Frantz Fanon, and immediately turns the conference on its head, sparking debate on whether we need a single strategy for African independence. How can nonviolent civil disobedience, protest, non-cooperation be the model for everyone? Ghana is not like Algeria. Ghana is not like South Africa. Fanon and his delegation from Algeria insist that it's not the means of liberation that is the goal, it is liberation is the goal. And so, and in part of my book, I write about the idea of Malcolm X, by any means necessary. Malcolm X didn't really advocate violence, he advocated self-defense, but he advocated liberation by any means necessary. That's kind of what Fanon is saying at the 58 conference, is that we should have liberation by any means necessary. So at the end of the conference, the statement they give is that they want to do positive action, but they also want to support liberation movements, particularly for self-defense as opposed to offense. So this gives legitimacy to Frelimo in Mozambique and the PIGC in Guinea-Bissau and FLN in Algeria. I'm moving ahead of myself. Now, as we get into the 1960s, though, we see South Africa shifts as well. Mandela, who was claiming to be a devotee of nonviolence as the leader of the ANC, their temperature changes there in South Africa. There's growing support for liberation movements in Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and in Angola. And so there's fear. King is paying attention to these things. Albert Luthuli, president of ANC, is paying attention. And there's concern that there's going to be a large racial war across the continent. And also in the United States, the temperature's changing, moving against this idea of a single strategy. Robert Williams, who's president of NAACP in North Carolina, says, we have a tradition of defending ourselves. We need to show force. That's the only way they're going to respect us. Ella Baker, who's one of the architects of the freedom movement of nonviolent civil disobedience, she disagreed with King on it. She says, we don't need to have a single strategy. Again, the goal is social justice by any means necessary. And in this moment, Albert Luthuli and King collaborate again on a statement against apartheid in 1962. They'd never met. They exchanged letters. They mostly communicated through the American Committee on Africa, but they issue these statements together. And this one is the statement against apartheid in South Africa is one of the strongest statements. And King, again, he's delivering speeches in support of it, raising money through the ACOA to free political prisoners in South Africa. So he's very active, not as active as he wants to be. He's always thinking that at some point he's going to be able to pay more attention to Africa than he's actually able to do. That same year, 1962, he helps organize the American Negro Conference on Africa. And this is a collection of all the civil rights movements, leaders of the civil rights movements in the United States. And they're going to think not just protest, not just solidarity, we need to lobby the United States government. This is what they want to form the first lobbying group. You remember Trans-Africa in the late 1970s, the 80s was the largest African-American lobbying group. The germ for that was much early, 1960s. And so King is a part of that. He's on the board of that. He helps organize the first conference. And they say they want more African-American diplomats. They're being a little, not naive, but overly optimistic when they want more African-American diplomats to influence the U.S. government. I think in the 1960s, I don't know how much influence they would have had, but the idea is that African-Americans have Africa's best interests at heart, and they'd be able to move the government to not work through the former colonial powers on Africa, but work with African governments directly. He writes a very powerful essay. It appeared in the Amsterdam News. The African-American press is very important for this history. I use the African Activist Archive, but African-American newspapers have been tremendous, just seeing these events take place. The Amsterdam News is one of, not just because I'm from Harlem and that's where it's based, but because it paid a lot of attention to international events, particularly in the Caribbean and in Africa. But he wrote a very powerful essay, The Negro Looks at Africa. No, The Negro Looks to Africa. And I say it's powerful because he's suggesting that, people think, he's suggesting that African Americans must derive their strategies from Africans. And that's one of the things I think is important about the anti-apartheid movement. And he's laying the groundwork, one of the ones who are laying the groundwork for this in the 60s. It's not, African Americans did not lead the anti-apartheid movement. They took their cues from particularly African exiles, South African exiles in London, in New York, in Washington, D.C. They're the ones who said, this is what we need you doing. So they see themselves as a supporting role. It's a big shift. Like 45 is that shift, the first Pan-African Congress that are dominated by Africans, run by Africans. There's a shift from taking cues from Africans and West Indians in the West, but now taking your cues from Africans. So he said, the Negro looks to Africa. African Americans must derive their inspiration from Africa as more and more African countries gain their independence. And this becomes a theme. This is his speech at it's not popular, at City Temple. He's on his way to, just a few more examples and I'll close. He's on his way to Oslo to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And he stops in London. He gives two very great speeches. The Guardian covers these brilliantly. You get a good sense of these. And there's some excerpts online as well. But he continues this theme of being concerned about a violent war of liberation all over Africa and growing unease about riots in the United States. this move away from the single strategy of nonviolent mass civil disobedience. He's also beginning to really criticize Britain and the United States, saying that they have the power to make sure that violence doesn't erupt in Africa by pressuring the Portuguese and pressuring the apartheid regime in South Africa. He says within weeks, Britain and the United States can make sure that there's a peaceful transition to liberation in Africa. And he repeats his statement that South Africa is the most important front in this battle. He makes it more pointedly, though. He says, we have violence in the U.S. We have injustice in the U.S., but we also have constitutional rights in the U.S. as people of African descent. The 14th Amendment guarantees us those rights. Now, local governments and state governments may not be respecting them, but we can take that to court. South Africans don't have that. So that's part of the reason why, that's part of his argument that we're all part of one larger struggle. The U.S. is a front in that struggle. The Portuguese are losing against Frelimo and FNLA and Angola and other groups in Angola. They're definitely losing against Cabral. Well, Cabral's not there, but in Guinea-Bissau, South Africa does not have the organization. They don't have the guerrilla armies, and they don't have the rights. So therefore, they're the most vulnerable. And that makes South Africa the most important front in the battle against white supremacy. And he repeats this line throughout the rest of his life until 68. He repeats this in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. He quotes one person. He cites one person in his acceptance speech of the Nobel Peace Prize. And guess who that is? One person he quotes. Albert Lutuli is the one person. This is the global king. This is what I used to call the African king. He sees himself as part of a larger struggle against white supremacy. He makes statements against Vietnam. He made one of the most powerful speeches I've ever read in my life, is why I oppose the war in Vietnam. Several weeks earlier, he made a similar speech, but he's criticizing the U.S. government, right? He criticizes foreign policies of the U.S. government in many speeches, but in no other part of the world outside of Africa does he declare himself to be in common cause, to have those struggles be part of his own struggles. And that's how I define him as the global king. I thank you all very much. I look forward to any questions, comments, and critiques. Of course, I had a bunch more, but when you go off script, you got to cut some out. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we open it to questions. So we start with people in the room. So if you have questions, and then we'll go online. Go ahead.
I have a question about why Gandhi and not Garvey?
Why? Good question. I think it's both. Let me think about it. Why Gandhi as a model and not Garvey? I think it was both and. I want to say, don't you think?
Probably.
Because let's take the African Gandhi, who by 67 is no longer the African Gandhi. He's armed revolutionary warfare. He writes a book called Armed Revolutionary Warfare. And positive action is no longer marching in the streets, but now picking up a gun and chasing the neoliberal neo-imperialists out of Ghana, out of Accra. But he's influenced by Garvey, very much so. Garvey's also influenced by Gandhi. In the Negro World is his newspaper. He's writing letters with Gandhi, and he asked Gandhi for a statement that he publishes in the Negro World. Du Bois also asked Gandhi for a statement that he publishes in the Negro World, showing you again Gandhi's, what I think is Gandhi's shift away from a more racist view of people of African descent. I don't think that African leaders, civil rights leaders of the 40s and 50s saw Garvey's prescription of what I would, let's say, call early proto-Black power, owning your businesses, controlling your resources, and also going back to Africa, which he never did, but going back to Africa as a solution to their immediate problems. Many did open businesses in Harlem and Chicago and Washington, D.C. He was very Philadelphia, very influential. but I don't, what he prescribed would not take care of the rights issue, the land issue, the constitutional issues. It could resolve the maybe long-term economic issues, but not the rights issues. So I think it's both and. I think Gandhi had the model and the philosophy. I think Garvey had more of an economic prescription.
Yeah, just a,
But maybe you have, because help me think through these things, right?
yeah, just a small point, which is that Garveyism really is based in Booker T. Washington's idea.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so Booker T. Washington would argue that his solution would provide immediate answers. You know, he said, invest in the business side of things, and it will solve the civil rights issue.
Right. But I think African Americans are very clear about the fact, I'm sure South Africans were very clear about the fact that all that can be taken away very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Because all the instances of African Americans building wealth outside of, let's say, anywhere south of Washington, D.C., anything, anywhere west of probably West Virginia, Missouri, I'm thinking of Missouri and I'm thinking Oklahoma, there were pogroms. We don't even talk about them. They're not, I don't know, I'm 51, I haven't read a high school textbook in 3 decades, but towns in Florida where they had these independent Black towns after slavery. Once the Union soldiers leave, they wipe them out. In North Carolina, they had elected officials. What's the town in North Carolina? Wilmington, the Wilmington massacre. They call it a race riot. It was not a race riot, it was a massacre. They owned the stores, but the white folks were frustrated that the Black folks had more wealth than them, and they were borrowing from the Black banks. And Black folks owned the land. They wiped them out. Tulsa's the most famous one in Oklahoma. Kansas, it happened in Kansas. There are towns in Texas. So the wealth does not resolve the rights issue, I think. But I think it's both and. Both are inspired. Both are inspired. Yeah.
No, but is there any interaction between Fanon and King?
I'm aware of no direct action between, no. You know, King, I don't know if Fanon was even in the United States. No, he didn't come to the United States. King was desperately trying to travel more. He was invited to go, like 4 big South African student associations, including the South African Student Organization of South African Students, South African Student Association. They all invited him to come. The Indian students invited King to come. The government blocked him. He certainly could not have traveled to Algeria at the time the war is going on. The only place they probably could have met was Cuba, and I don't believe that King went to Cuba. So no, he certainly read Fanon, disagreed with him, but he certainly read him because he's a philosophy person. But you want to explain part of the question?
No,
just curious. Okay, yeah. I think, yeah, his right. Yeah. King's travels were, he spent a lot of time in the Caribbean. That's where he wrote, in the Caribbean. And then he took big trips to the UK, at least 2. He went to Nigeria twice, went to Ghana once. I don't think he made it to Kenya. But Tom Mboya came over at least twice. He hosted Tom Mboya twice, the Kenyan trade unionist, who everyone thought was going to become succeed Kenneth. Jomo Kenyatta. I was going to say Uhuru Kenyatta. Jomo Kenyatta, yes. We thought, I think even most people in Kenya probably thought he was going to succeed Jomo Kenyatta. Yeah.
So I love how you're linking the Southern African liberation struggles to King, and I'm just curious, you mentioned the Portuguese struggles in Mozambique and Angola, and of course the South African struggle, and sort of smack dab in the middle of all those is the Rhodesian Zimbabwe struggle. Does he weigh in on that? Does that factor in your thinking, or is it just there's more South Africans in the U.S. and so that's sort of front center for him?
Yeah. So he makes these statements that I've read that where he includes Mozambique and Angola. He doesn't say Guinea-Bissau so much. He talks about Southern Africa. Settler colonies in Southern Africa. He gets more into South Africa. I think that has to, I suspect that has to do with the American Committee on Africa. They're heavily invested in South Africa. The exiles, the political prisoners, supporting exiles, supporting students. And so most of his activism is through the American Committee on Africa. So I think that's why. Now I think maybe there's something peculiar about what's going on in Southern Rhodesia at the time. He's certainly he's certainly working around issues in Northern Rhodesia because he's in direct communication with Kaunda, who comes over a couple of times
Like,
as well.
you know, 6 months after he's given this talk here that's on the screen, right, we have the unilateral declaration of independence.
Mhm.
Right?
The unilateral, yeah.
Says,
Yeah.
We're never leaving here in 1,000 years, right? So.
You know, I think if he had lived long enough, and this is one question Peter asked me about, the shift, Kwame Nkrumah's shift toward revolutionary warfare, the opening up of African Americans' imagination to other forms of gaining your rights. Kenneth Kaunda becoming president of Zambia. Well, now I'm head of state. You can't be nonviolent now. I support nonviolence, but I also have to protect our interests. I suspect if he had lived longer, I don't think he would have ever said, yes, we support the guerrillas in Southern Rhodesia. But I think he would have, what he began to say is, we're talking about this, what he began to say is, he condemns those who bring those who have to defend their rights through violence, right? He's not going to condemn those who resort to the violence to protect their interests. So Mkhonto Sizwe is not morally reprehensible. It's the South African apartheid regime. They've been forced into this position. And so I don't know if that's a shift or that he's now saying what he always, when King first started, he carried a gun. He had to be brought to this position of nonviolence, like 56, 57.
Just to in part answer to John's question, in my research, I spoke to Nathan Shamharira, who was one of the prominent ministers in Robert Mugabe's first government. And much as Martin Luther King may not have spoken directly to the Zimbabwe issue, the activists professed that it was King's ideas that fueled them.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that, particularly with the students. He met with some students in London and they organized, actually an organization I think still exists. He met with them the night before a speech and I think continued to communicate with them. He was communicating with a lot of students. Now you got me thinking if there are some Southern Rhodesian students, but there are a lot of students. It's hard to get at all these archives.
This particular ex-minister was a student here in the United States.
And that's what
So
makes it,
there's a very strong linkage of a cadre of them that were in the United States and that were consuming King's ideas and using them back home.
The irony, I think, in looking at South Africa, not Southern Rhodesia so much, but in the American context, they're not saying who's the African Gandhi, who's the African American Gandhi, but everyone wants the African king, right? They wanted Albert Lutuli, after he died, he was the African Martin Luther King, Mandela, but then he turns him Mkhonto Sizwe, Bishop Tutu. Oh my gosh, they could not stop comparing Bishop Tutu to Martin Luther King. And ironically, when Mandela gets out, I don't know if you remember when he met with George Bush, and he goes to the White House, and George Bush gives this is when things were really ratcheting up in South Africa. Like war was like gonna happen tomorrow. Or war was happening, but it was about to get very serious any day now. South Africa was shut down. And Bush gives this long speech, written speech. Mandela standing there looking very stoic, no expression on his face, as was his wont. And Bush is saying, both sides have to come together. Both sides have to use the path of nonviolence. Both sides have to choose peace. They have to work this out together, as if the Black South Africans had any power in this. But then he says, I'm paraphrasing, we need to follow the path of Martin Luther King, who said X, Y, and Z about love your neighbor and nonviolence. This is the beginning of white Republicans always having to quote King anytime they do anything as cover. But then Mandela gets up there and he rejects that out of hand. He basically says, we're not going to have a single strategy. We're not disavowing anything. Everything's on the table. And anything we choose to use as a response to your allies, brutal, brutish, savage violence. But invoking this king, everywhere he went, that he was distracted by, will you denounce violence? Will you denounce, why won't you? And people are criticizing for not denouncing violence. White people have a monopoly on moral violence. They can use violence and it's morally sound, legitimate. The moment Africans use violence, it's unjust, it's illegitimate, right? We can't talk, right? What's that? They're terrorists. They're terrorists. We can see this right now with the conversations around Israel and Palestine, in Gaza. They're terrorists.
Even Mandela himself was classified by America as a terrorist.
He was taken off the list, I think.
Even when he became the president, he was still classified as a terrorist.
I think he was on there even after he left office. I think he was.
Yeah, he was classified as a terrorist.
Yes. And the language they use for beyond terrorism. Yeah.
Yeah, I got a dash, but I did want to ask a question. I actually had the privilege of living in South Africa. And so a lot of my South African friends taught me, they were different drivers, everyday people. And they would say that, I remember one artisan saying to me that your history is my history. And then that person really awakened something in me. And so what I learned is that South Africans learned their strategies from indigenous domestic Black people in the United States. So what was it that King was saying that Negroes could learn from South Africa?
So you take a quote. It's decontextualized.
Oh.
King was getting frustrated. It's sort of like with the letter from Birmingham jail. That was to African-American pastors. You're not doing enough. You're being cowardly. You have to step up, and the fight is here. You have to join it. He was growing a disillusion with two things. This ongoing kind of go slow itness among African-Americans. And he was seeing things happening in Africa. 1960, all these countries gaining independence, governments organizing, they're coming together to form the OAU, I think the following year, must have been, right? So they're doing things. So he said, we now we're looking, Africa is getting themselves together, and here we still are, trying the same methods, not really moving. So there was a level of frustration that he had. Now, was that the sentiment across? Probably not, but that's what he was expressing.
Is it not what Marcus Garvey criticized the boys for that? You guys want to assimilate. Yeah, you don't want to confront.
Yeah, I think he was hoping for a little more interest also. Part of that article, he said the Negro is gaining more interest in Africa and African affairs, optimistically. And then he goes on to say why that's good. There's a lot we can learn from them taking the reins and defining their own. This is a period where there's still optimism that Africans and people of African descent could actually change the world. Like many people thought these revolutions were going to be revolutionary. And Ghana was going to be the model, right? All we need to do is take care of South Africa. Once we get these settlers out of here and bring in, well, they didn't want to get, let's bring democracy. Let's bring equality to South Africa. It's kind of like when Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah is seeking first the political kingdom. Once we get independence, everything else is going to be fine. People believed in 1950s to the 1970s that real global transformations were possible. Now, looking back, of course, we could put on our glasses and be smug and say, they were naive, but they were going to change the world. When people talk about revolutionaries in the United States, they say, that's just rhetoric. No, they thought revolution was coming. They thought they were ready for the revolution. That was a slogan, ready for the revolution. That's why I think and this is a whole other conversation. That's why I think the 80s was so shocking. People in Africa, it's like, what's going on? We have debt and devaluation of currencies and all these lending agencies coming in. And now we have all these coups d'etats and stuff. I think Africa still may be in shock from all that. And now we have African-American activists who are basically tools of the Democratic National Committee. Anyway, unless I digress.
Your title slide, flyer for African's speech,
and listed Miriam Makeba is one of the
the
star participants.
Yes.
Now, Miriam Makeba was also well known to be a PNC
ambassador.
I can't get this letter.
Do you know, if at all, Dr. King dealt with the ANC PAC rivalry? Because it kind of speaks to some of the tensions that my colleagues here are raising, partly through Garvey and others. Now, the integrationist versus separatist approach to liberation in a sense, because the PAC was Africa for the Africans in the
Right.
Garveyite tradition.
Yeah.
And they formed the organization as a result of the Freedom Charter.
That's
as
right.
a result of the Congress
That's
of the
right.
People. They did not want this.
They had a lot of criticism of the Freedom
Right,
Charter.
and
Yeah.
so I suspect Dr. King's ecumenicalism and universalism
Yeah.
would be the antithesis of that, but did you see in the sources any?
I didn't see him-
weighing in on it?
He didn't weigh in on South African politics in that way. Well, Mary McCabe did a lot of fundraisers for the ACOA. You know, when I first was looking at it, I called it ACOA. I was saying ACOA. ACOA sounds so cool. But then Bill Minter said, we never said ACOA. It's the ACOA. I said, that's so disappointing because ACOA is cool. But no, so he was King's engagement with South Africa, students who wrote him, and the ACOA. And Mary McCabe was, I don't think he was ecumenical about it. Yeah, I don't really see.
Stayed out of it.
Yeah, he stayed out of it. And I think rightly so.
Probably wisely.
Yeah, wisely, I would think. I'm even trying to think if he even. No, his critiques are for the apartheid regime. He wouldn't take sides or even have a comment on that. I don't even know if the ACOA really took sides. They favored the ANC for sure because they're pacifists. But I don't know how closely they work with the PAC. That's a good question. To go back online and look. Yes.
How about Patrice Lumumba?
Mm-hmm. King in general or the African American movement?
The movement.
Oh, it was huge. I think it was huge for African Americans as well. It was a turning point. It was a turning point. Definitely. I mean, the famously African American activists stormed the UN chamber and shout up, there. And there were protests more on the very, very grassroots. Civil rights organizations weren't that involved in that. But you have more, SNCC is condemning it, more the left-leaning civil rights organizations might condemn it. But Patrice Lumumba's assassination was a big, because also this idea of what the UN is going to change. We're thinking African independence, how are we going to guarantee this? We have so many seats now in the General Assembly. We have votes. We're going to be a bloc in the spirit of Bandung. We're going to vote together. And then the UN, they betrayed Ghana because Nkrumah sent troops, and they betrayed Patrice Lumumba. They broke their charter, and so African American watchers. I forget his name, but there was a documentary that interviewed the African American woman who organized that storming of the UN. Do you know that, Michelle? No, yeah. So Lumumba factors a great deal. I said, but there's so much going on in 1960 also. Okay? But I think all these things factor in where the winds of change blowing.
So you anticipated my question a little bit by bringing in the UN, because I was going to ask about, so thinking in terms of King, the global, at the same time that he's kind of becoming who we all know him. We're all so I'm curious, I feel like I should know this, but I don't. So how was he thinking about that level or that layer of kind of international,
Like international
governance, or, international activism, mobilization, organization? Like, was there an interplay?
Yeah, so he was pulled because he really wanted to be, my interpretation, some of this psychoanalytic. He wanted to be a global leader, particularly in the African space, or African descendant space. He's pulled deeply into the domestic sphere. So his concern is government, is governance. and the organizations he's involved with are, if they're interested in the international scene, it's like the American Negro Conference on Africa, they're concerned with diplomacy, but not the UN itself. I don't really see him engaged in the UN in that way. He may reference it. I could easily be wrong, but he may reference it, but he's not invested in the same way that Kwame Nkrumah, for example, really believed the UN was, I'm thinking most of these newly independent African countries believe the UN was going to be the way that they leveraged their numeric strength and then ultimately down the line protect their national resources and transform their societies. But he investing in the UN, because he's not a statesman, he's an activist. So I think that's what changes now, where because there's so many elected officials, like in South Africa and the United States, no South Africans coming to the United States really are meeting with African-American activists. They're meeting with elected officials. And African-American elected officials are not going to Soweto and meeting with activists. They're meeting with, well, now I was going to say the government, but that's the ANC that's being redundant. They're meeting with the ANC. Well, maybe not for long. So that's the times he was in. He wasn't a statesman.
And it also could be to the frame, right? Civil rights versus, say, human rights, right? With Malcolm, you know.
Well, that is a difference.
Malcolm spent more time focusing on the UN with this focus on
in the last 2 years.
The focus for King ends up being civil rights, which is more narrowly defined.
In the last 2 years, and I think that's a regional divide as well. Again, thinking about the Garvey question, King is in the South, where people are literally dying, can't protect their economic interests, can't organize, right? Where Malcolm X is in the North, where there is segregation, but they're not facing an existential crisis.
Human rights are a little too airy for folks who are facing the barrel of a gun.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's the critique. And I don't want to get a whole domestic conversation, but when people critique King and Malcolm X, they weren't that different. It's not like here's King and here's Malcolm X. Here's violence, here's nonviolence. Here's human rights, here's civil rights. It wasn't. It's more of a melange on both their parts. But there's definitely a regional difference, there's constituent difference. And also, King was part of an organization where, Malcolm, when he was the Nation of Islam, he spoke very differently. And so only that last year and a half, he becomes a Pan-Africanist, he becomes an international statement, he starts to speak human rights.
Well, say what you will about the slow progress within the US government, the UN's gears turn even slower.
As they turn it all.
So before we leave, we have some questions.
Okay.
I think you answered the questions about probably there would be a turn, but Tiffany raised their hand, like, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, that's Tiffany. I know her. She has a hand raised.
Hey, Dr. Talton. So I had a question about your impetus for revisiting King's legacy. I mean, if you could just share with us, because I feel like there is a persistence, a durability in the historical record of really positioning King and, really, I think just essentially freezing him in his nonviolent tradition, right? And I think that serves a particular purpose, and I appreciate the recovery of this aspect of his legacy. And I wonder if you could speak about how you came to this and why.
Oh, I appreciate that. Part of it is it's what you said, just frustration with one part, frustration with how we view King as stuck at the March on Washington speech and as a dreamer, and the ways in which, particularly on the political right, they constantly reference his colorblindness, his aspirations for a colorblind society, where people aren't judged by the content of their character. But people are judged by the content of the character. And that's actually what's going on now. They're not being judged by the content of the character. Where people are not judged by the color of the skin, but the content of their character. And that's being weaponized. And we're going to see it being weaponized more and more, even with Trump's most recent DEI attacks. It's couched as colorblindness. It's couched as a way to protect against discrimination. So they're weaponizing the language of the civil rights movement, weaponizing King. Also, I'm really attracted to King and others. King's just one. Now, the book that I deals with many figures. King, this is just one small part of the book. But the ways in which each of these figures position their movements as within a broader movement against a larger structure of injustice. Tom Boyer uses this language coming from Kenya, right? And that's one of the benefits of coming to the United States is not only to raise money, but also to be in common cause with civil rights activists here. In the latter years of Malcolm X's life, he repeatedly said that, right? He's a Pan-Africanist now. So to position King as one of the actors who are animating that sentiment of common cause and also acting in that, collaborating in statements, raising money. He actively raised money for African movements. He sponsored African students to come to the United States. He sponsored speaking tours. So to be not only rhetorically involved in the struggle, but to be actively involved in the struggle, I think for someone like King, who we have stuck on that day in 1963, is a very powerful lesson for how we should be looking at this history. Is there another question on that?
Jessica, read the second question.
Oh, okay. Yes, it has started. Sorry, you can't hear anything. That's the first question. Hasn't started yet.
Oh, no, it's the.
I know. I'm.
The King thing, not the chat. Oh,
Yeah. See what happened. Please change. Yeah. So this is part of what I was ending with, the question about this shift from a single strategy of nonviolent mass action to, and I'm very clear about nonviolent mass action because there's always been nonviolent actors. And there's always been, various forms, but I'm very clear that the strategy is nonviolent mass action. The shift to that toward armed revolutionary warfare, armed struggle, do we think if King survived, would he have made that shift? And I say, no, he would not have made that shift. It's ahistorical for me to say that because he died and we can't see it. So as a historian, we don't make those claims. But it does not, all evidence suggests that he would have, as Albert Lutuli remained in his position, a little more open to capacious confrontations with injustice and imperialism, but still not saying that I support armed revolutionary warfare. But I think his position was definitely evolving, for sure. It was evolving, but I think you'd be hard pressed to see checks being made out to Frelimo from Martin Luther King. Yes, ma'am. Ooh, was it the right strategy?
Yeah, having that peace, like that peaceful, like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What does it matter what I think? So I'm gonna hedge and use Ali Mazrui. Professor Mazrui has a lot of critiques of these single strategies and nonviolent mass action. He said, even in the American context, but even let's say the Ghanaian context, again, these people thought they were transforming the world. Kwame Nkrumah said from Guinea that nonviolence is not going to get you where you want to go. It's just not. He said it can bring you certain things, but it's not going to bring you revolutionary change. And like Fanon, if you want to transform society, it must be done through not soul force, as Gandhi says, but in actual physical force. So Kwame Nkrumah turns to armed revolutionary warfare. Mazrui says nonviolence can get you voting rights. It can get you better economic access, better financial circumstances. But it's not going to change the structure of that is oppressive. That is neoliberalism. That is violence. You're not going to change that through nonviolence. That has to be changed by force. Now, how I feel about that doesn't really matter. But I somewhat agree with Mazrui. But look at South Africa. Right? Look at South Africa. Look at Kenya. Look at Ghana. Structurally, Senegal. Structurally, it has not. They have not fundamentally changed. These are colonial economies.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna argue. Like I feel like in South Africa, we're like, I feel like I call it Stockholm syndrome because 80% of the land is still owned by like 50% of the population, and then with the percentage that does own the land, you see a stark difference between like who their housekeepers are. Yeah, it's not slavery, but it's dang near slavery at this point. And then, like, I don't know, like, I thought she was not like systems that work.
So we agree. Success. Yes.
What's your take on the recent offer by President Trump to protect white South Africa?
Oh, that's what I meant.
For the false claim that Africans are taking rain from what's happening. What's your take on that? And also, when you look at from your presentation, we have narrated how the civil rights movement contributed to South Africa. All these America has put a lot to try to free South Africa. Now the current government wants to protect the white South Africans. What's your take on that?
There are a number of ways we can go about that. I would say the history of the United States in the 20th century is more consistent with Trump right now than it has been the other way. Most governments have supported, most US regimes have supported white minority rule in South Africa. Right? It's only Clinton, Obama, Biden. And that's not even all that much. Obama was, we could get into that, but the United States has a long history of the United States government supporting white minority rule in South Africa. That's one. So I think Trump is being very consistent with the racist neoliberalism that is the United States of America. The second part of that is what's scary, and this is more of a domestic conversation, the state of the world that we're all in. I only have one passport. Many of you have two, God bless you. So my passport is the US, so I'm kind of stuck. The current president gets his information from certain places. Most not places that he's read, mostly he's watched, or people have said it to him. And so Elon Musk has his ear. And Elon Musk, you know, even from his first presidency, he's feeding him this. I think I don't have the receipts on that, but I think Elon Musk is feeding him this narrative. And also he's what's it called, whistleblowing? To, you know, this is an attempt to he's gaslighting. He's gaslighting. Thank you. Dog whistle. He's dog whistling. Sorry, I did this yesterday. But I think he's dog whistling. And the way that he speaks about clearing out Gaza, the way he talks about what was Vansky, the speech about the far right in Germany. This is all it's all a piece, I think. But it's a symptom of a much broader issue. You know, Trump is not the problem.
Is there any linkage between South Africa government taking Israel to ICC and their punishment, which Trump is beating out on them? Is it simply the narrative we have given, or do you see any link?
I don't know. My other experts there, it's beyond drifting beyond my profile. What are your thoughts?
Oh.
Yeah. What about the link? Do you have an answer for that? The links between South Africa taking.
When I look at this whole thing, because there's no land that has been there. South Africa is still using willing seller with buyers. This is why also the blacks are frustrated and the ANC lost the majority. So that's a false claim. Of course, Elon Musk, I alluded to that. He's also a South African who rejected South Africa and took the mother's Canadian citizenship. And, you know, when I look at South Africa also taking Israel to court, ICC, I knew there were going to be consequences. I suspected that. And when he looks at, when Trump says ICC should stop punishing South Africa, Israel, and then in America, I think it was a second one. South Africa is being punished for their anti-Israel states, and also their refusal to vote in the UN when Russia invaded Ukraine. South Africa refused to vote.
Oh, I think that's a good take. That's a good take.
Well, it was just more of a comment, if anyone can say, and throughout your whole lecture, and I've been hearing throughout, and that's just simply the role of capital money. You know, or even as a bargaining chip, or even, you know, like now he said no aid to South Africa. Do they cave? that happened with Colombia.
Happened with Colombia in 2
It
days.
happened with, okay, we're shipping some people there. Colombia, you know, had resistance for what?
2
Maybe
days.
12 hours? Or then even think about Gaza being turned into a bunch of resorts. So it's more of a comment as these weave it in. So it's not an either or anything, but as it weaves throughout. Yeah,
Mhm.
you know, just to where even taking a look at the changes, like you're saying historically, there are through lines, but there's just these real changes with the orientation of capital as well. And
Mhm. Well, King spoke a lot about that.
oh yeah,
The evils of the evils
as well. Yeah.
The evils of capitalism, materialism, and consumerism. Well, capitalism, materialism, and racism. Yeah.
I mean, you know, right
Mhm.
now.
Oh, then, yeah,
what
Elon
Trump
Musk.
is doing is consolidating across,
Mhm.
my mind, across anchors of white supremacy and capital.
Yeah, absolutely. But Michelle, what I'm thinking about is because I use the term in my manuscript, white supremacy, this, and what King is again, what that means, and he gets into capitalism, materialism, and racism. But I'm learning from the right is that these terms that must be explained are become an obstacle to selling your point. Right? We see this with all sorts of things, and they'll take it and they'll turn it around. So I was thinking when I revised the manuscript to avoid white supremacy, because that's a term that, what do you mean by, it's like white privilege. It doesn't really work.
That would race, I mean, I think that would race.
It's hard. They will do that with a lot of things, but let's not make it easy. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, she had one more,
One,
and then I'm
okay,
gonna
go
get my
ahead.
pizza.
So me and my friends talk about this. What do you feel like the current of the Black community is moving forward to, like futuristically, and where like getting our objectives achieved? Because me and my friends often discuss, there seems to be no, there's not a common, I don't know, what's the word, not code anymore.
Common cause?
Yeah, there's not a common cause, like a lot of people don't have, like, when I talk to people, I think a lot of people that look like me, they don't have the same conviction about topics that seem pretty like on the nose. And what, like, how do you feel like the community is gonna be looking like moving forward? Because we don't have any leaders and we don't have a universal, I want to say middle, when it comes to like seeing things that doesn't make sense. Or the best way I can describe it is like determine, oh, you're invited to the cookout. That like always including, always like not everyone's on the same page when it comes to that.
Yeah. We'll talk some over pizza, but my quick
Yes,
my quick take is that until the 1980s, there's a common shared problem, whether it was in South Africa with apartheid, whether it was the rights issues here in the States, racism in the States. In Ireland, the problem was clear. And the message was a little clearer. We were reading the same text, watching the same documentaries. We had 3 channels, for God's sake, right? And we did not have a cinema in our pockets. Where now there's a multiplicity of media, voices. The problems are not, they're apparent to those of us who are keen observers, but there's no agreement on what the shared problem is. I don't think, whether you're in South Africa, whether you're in Australia or the United States, it's not just a Black American thing or people of African descent thing. I think that's good, and that's how you get Elon Musk in the White House, because we're not paying attention. We're paying attention to other things. So that's my quick answer. And what does that forebode for us? What does that mean for the future? Let's have some pizza and we can talk.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Talton.